The Naval Special Warfare Briefing Room in Norfolk, Virginia, was a cavern of controlled tension. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, sterile drone against the acoustic ceiling tiles, reflecting off polished linoleum floors that had been scuffed by countless pairs of combat boots. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the faint, lingering musk of Kevlar and canvas. On the walls, the muted flat-screen monitors displayed the command's crest, a testament to the legacy of the men and women who had passed through these halls. Nearly 300 officers and senior enlisted personnel from every branch of the U.S. military filled the folding chairs, which were arranged in neat, precise rows. The audience was a tapestry of camouflage patterns: Army combat uniforms in operational camouflage pattern, Air Force OCPs, Marine Corps MARPAT, and the distinctive Navy NWUS. They were warriors, analysts, and operators, and they had been summoned for a joint service briefing on a matter of utmost strategic importance. The low murmur of pre-meeting conversation, a sound like distant thunder, was abruptly cut short. A heavy metal door at the front of the room swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and a man walked to the podium. He was a United States Navy SEAL captain, his physique a testament to years of unforgiving physical conditioning. His face, tanned and deeply lined, was framed by a high and tight haircut, like now more salt than pepper. He wore the Navy's service dress khakis, a uniform that projected authority. On his chest was a massive fruit salad of ribbons and medals, topped by the coveted seal pin, an eagle clutching a trident, anchor, and flintlock pistol. He placed a thin folder on the podium and surveyed the room. His eyes, the color of slate, moved slowly, deliberately, making contact with the front row, then the middle, then the very back. He didn't tap the microphone or ask for attention. He simply stood there, a monument of quiet authority, and the room fell silent. The silence was so complete that the hum of the ventilation system became the dominant sound. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried to every corner of the room without the need for amplification. It was a voice accustomed to being heard over the roar of helicopter rotors and the crack of small arms fire. "I'm not going to stand here and waste your time with a bunch of PowerPoint slides," he began, his voice devoid of any political correctness or tactical jargon. "You've all read the intel packets. You know the target. You know the risks. The slide deck is available on the SIPRnet if you need to check specific coordinates or call signs later." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. He looked down at the podium for a second, then back up. "But before we get into the weeds of the operation, there's something I need to know, something that isn't in the official Navy doctrine, and it's not on any of your qualification score sheets." A palpable shift occurred in the room. The operators, used to clear-cut orders and specific intelligence, leaned forward in their seats. The planners stopped tapping on their laptops. The captain's next words were not just a question, they were a key, and he was about to see which lock it would fit. And he gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles whitening slightly. He looked up at the assembled crowd, his gaze sweeping across the room one last time. Then, in a clear, resonant voice that cut through the sterile air like a sonar ping, he asked, "Do we have any war pilots in the room?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and jarring. This was a special operations briefing, not a naval aviation wing meeting. The logical attendees were ground-pounding infantry, explosive ordnance disposal technicians, intelligence specialists, and combat controllers. A few people shifted in their seats, confused. A young Army captain in the third row looked at his colleague and shrugged slightly. The SEAL captain waited, his expression unchanging, giving no hint as to why he was asking for an extinct, almost mythological breed. For a long, agonizing 10 seconds, there was nothing but the hum of the lights. Then, at the very back of the room, near the door, there was a slight scraping sound of a chair on linoleum. A figure began to rise. It was a woman. She was unassuming at first glance, dressed in the standard olive green flight suit of the Air Force, but it hung on her in a way that suggested it was a garment worn out of regulation, not habit. There were no vivid patches indicating a current fighter squadron, no Bagram or Baghdad combat patches sewn onto the right sleeve. Her name tape read Coleman. Her hair, a simple, no-nonsense ponytail of chestnut brown streaked with gray, was pulled tight against her scalp. She wasn't tall, perhaps 5'4", but as she rose to her full height, she seemed to expand and fill the space. Her face was pale, etched with fine lines that bespoke age, yes, but also long hours staring into a sun-scorched sky at 30,000 feet. She gently lifted herself to stand, a movement that was graceful, yet deliberate. Every eye in the room swiveled toward her. The SEAL captain, surprised but professionally composed, nodded once. "Ma'am," he acknowledged. She didn't walk down the aisle. She walked along the back wall and then down the side, her boots making soft, firm sounds on the floor. As she passed, the younger servicemen and women got a clearer look at her. It wasn't just the gray in her hair that marked her, it was her eyes. They were an unsettling pale blue, the color of a high-altitude sky, and they held a look that was both distant and intensely focused. The 1,000-yard stare of a sniper, but one who had engaged targets at Mach 2. She reached the front of the room and stood beside the captain, who gestured for her to take the podium. She shook her head politely, declining, preferring to stand to the side, facing the audience. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her. She looked frail for a moment, to a woman in her late 50s facing down a room full of warriors in their physical prime. Then she opened her mouth, and the frailty vanished. "Captain," she said, her voice quiet, but with a resonance that filled the room effortlessly. It was a voice with a slight Midwestern twang, flattened by years of radio discipline and international travel. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Coleman, United States Air Force, retired." She paused. "And yes, I was a pilot. A war pilot." She didn't look at the captain. She looked at the assembled troops. The captain here asked a question that most of you probably think doesn't have an answer anymore. You think of pilots as aviators, kids with $2,000 sunglasses and patches on their chests who fly multi-million-dollar drones from a trailer in Nevada. You think of flight as a technical skill, a support function. Her eyes narrowed slightly. But a war pilot? That's something else. That's a breed they stopped making a long time ago. She took a half-step closer to the front row. "I was commissioned in 1986. I learned to fly in T-37s and T-38s. I was one of the first women to set foot in a United States Air Force fighter cockpit. I flew the A-10 Warthog. Then I transitioned to the F-15E Strike Eagle. I flew in Operation Desert Storm, Operation Southern Watch, and Operation Allied Force. I have 260 combat hours. I have dropped bombs on enemy positions. I have been shot at. I have been hit." The room was utterly silent. You could hear the breathing of the man in the front row. This wasn't a briefing. It was a history lesson from a living artifact. "I'm telling you this not to impress you," she continued, her tone softening slightly, becoming almost conspiratorial. "I'm telling you this so you understand the context of my answer to the captain's question, because I know why he asked it. He didn't ask if we had any aviators. He asked if we had any war pilots." She looked back at the SEAL captain, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She turned back to the crowd. "He asked because he's about to send you into a situation that is ambiguous. A situation where the rules of engagement are going to shift by the minute. A situation where you can't rely on a joint terminal attack controller to talk you through it. And you can't wait for a Reaper feed to show you what's behind the next wall." She pointed a finger at them, her voice dropping to a near whisper that forced them to lean in. "In a situation like that, you don't need a pilot. You need a war pilot. You need someone who understands that the airplane isn't just a machine, it's a weapon. You need someone who understands that the sky isn't a highway, it's a battlefield. She paused, letting the words sink in. There's a difference between flying and fighting. Any monkey can be trained to pull back on the stick and keep the blue side up. It takes a warrior to push the throttle forward when the flak is thick, to put your nose on a target when your aircraft is screaming at you to turn away, to make the split-second decision. That means the difference between the boys on the ground coming home or not. Sarah Coleman then began to tell them a story. It wasn't in the official after-action report. It wasn't a story that would ever make it into the history books. It was a story that lived only in her memory and in the fading ink of a personal logbook. The date was February 27th, 1991. It was the night of the ground war. I was flying a night mission in my Strike Eagle, call sign Viper 24, with my weapons system officer, a kid from Ohio named Mike Stitch Kowalski. Our target was a Republican Guard convoy retreating along the highway north of Kuwait City. As it was a target-rich environment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks, we were doing tank plinking with our lantern pod, dropping GBU-12S on the stragglers. She looked down at the floor as if seeing the cockpit again. We were at 20,000 feet, Angels 20, in a left-hand orbit, waiting for our turn on target. The sky was a fireworks show, SAMs, AAA, tracers going up from the ground. It was chaos, but it was our chaos. We owned the night. Her voice tightened. Then my radios lit up. And it wasn't the AWACS or the Airborne Battle Commander. It was a scratchy, weak transmission on a guard frequency. A soldier's voice, broken up by static and the sound of small arms fire in the background. He was a sergeant, call sign Renegade 6. His team was a Special Forces A-team inserted deep behind Iraqi lines. They had been compromised. They were taking fire from 3 sides. They were pinned down in a wadi, and they were about to be overrun. They were calling for immediate air support. But their JTAC was down. He was dead. They had no eyes on us. They just had a prayer and a radio. She looked up, her pale blue eyes locking onto the SEAL captain, then the men and women in the room. That's the moment right there. That's the line between aviator and war pilot. My orders were to hit the convoy. My fuel was getting low. My wingman was Winchester, out of bombs. There was no other air support in the immediate area. The safe choice, the smart choice, the check-the-box choice, was to tell them to hold on, to relay their coordinates to the AWACS, and to wait for the next available package. That's what the book says to do. That's what the training says to do. She shook her head slowly. But Stitch and I, we looked at each other. We didn't need to speak. We knew. There were Americans down there in the mud fighting for their lives. They couldn't wait 10 minutes. They couldn't wait 5 minutes. They needed help now. So I keyed the mic. Renegade 6, Viper 24, and I have 2 GBU-12S with your name on them. Talk to me. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah Coleman and her WSO became the eyes of a desperate ground team. They couldn't see the enemy. The weather was socked in at low level, and the infrared pod was having trouble penetrating the smoke and haze from the burning oil fields. The Special Forces team, huddled in the dark, had to describe their position relative to terrain features, and to trace the enemy's location by the sound of their machine guns and the direction of their tracer fire. We had to improvise, she said. We had to think like infantry. We had to visualize the battlefield from their perspective. We were flying at 12,000 feet, in a constant 30-degree bank, trying to keep them on our wingtip, trying to build a mental picture of the battle space. Stitch was feeding me headings, distances, danger-close parameters. I was doing the math in my head. Wind speed. The drift, release altitude. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the side of the podium. I dropped my first bomb based on a description of a bent tree and the sound of an AK-47. It was not a precise, sanitized, computer-generated drop. It was a gut feel combat art drop. The bomb hit 200 meters from their position. It was close. The second bomb, based on a correction from the ground, hit 100 meters out. It silenced one of the enemy machine gun nests. We had no more bombs. We were Winchester. But we had gas. And we had 20-millimeter cannon rounds. She looked at the audience, her expression fierce. So we stayed. We couldn't bomb anymore, but we could be loud. We could be a presence. We dove down, 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 through the murk, until we broke out of the clouds at 500 feet. We were in the envelope. We were low and slow enough that they could see us. We made dry passes, screaming over their heads at 500 knots, the roar of our engines a message to the enemy and a comfort to our guys. We were a targeting platform, a communications relay, and a psychological warfare asset, all rolled into one. We were the cavalry. She finally let go of the podium, her hands dropping to her sides. We stayed on station until we were literally running on fumes, until the fuel low-level warning lights were blinking in the cockpit. As we turned to head north to the tanker, I looked back. I couldn't see them, but I heard the voice of Renegade 6-1 last time on the radio. It was breaking up, but I heard it. Viper 24, you are my angel in the sky. Get home safe. The silence in the room was absolute, a living thing. Sarah Coleman took a deep breath, the sound of it loud in the quiet. She looked at the SEAL captain. You asked if there were any war pilots in the room, Captain. There aren't. There are just pilots. We didn't pass it on. The culture changed. We got too technical, too reliant on sensors, too far removed from the mud. Now, we forgot that the most important sensor is the human heart. We forgot that the mission isn't about the aircraft. It's about the people on the ground. She turned back to the audience one last time. So, as you go into this fight, remember my story. Remember that the technology you carry is a tool, not a brain. Remember that the rules of engagement are guidelines, not handcuffs. And remember that somewhere, maybe over a hill, maybe in a valley, there might be a sergeant, huddled in the dark, praying for an angel in the sky. Don't make him pray alone. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. That's all I have. Without another word, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Coleman retired, walked back along the side wall, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. She reached the back of the room, opened the heavy metal door, and was gone. The door closed with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The SEAL captain stood at the podium for a long moment, staring at the door. And then he cleared his throat, looked down at his notes, and said, his voice thick with a newfound respect, "Okay, let's get to work." But everyone in that room knew that the real briefing was over. They had just been given an order more powerful than any in the folder on the podium, the order to be worthy of the name.